My name is Nadia Callum. I'm 31 years old. And the afternoon my mother spoke those 11 words outside the auditorium at my university graduation was the afternoon I understood that some people will only believe in what you've built once they need something from it. She didn't whisper it. That was the part that settled into me and stayed. She said it at a normal conversational volume, in a cluster of maybe 14 people, my Aunt Patricia, my cousin Dree, two of my mom's friends from her book club, my younger brother Marcus, and a handful of graduating students and their families who happened to be passing within earshot. The sun was directly overhead. I had my diploma in my left hand and my cap in my right, the tassel still damp from where I'd sweated through the ceremony. A design degree. Cute. What exactly is the plan when the phase ends? My aunt laughed. Not a big laugh, more of a relieved one, the kind that says thank you for saying what I was thinking. My cousin Dree looked at her shoes. Marcus glanced at me and then at the ground. I stood there for exactly 3 seconds, which I know because I counted them, and then I smiled at the group, shook the dean's hand one more time as he passed. He'd come back outside to take photos with families, and I said, "I'll meet everyone at the restaurant." Then I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and did not drive anywhere for about 6 minutes. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I opened the folder on my lap that held my diploma, and I read my own name on it, printed in a font I privately thought was slightly too ornate, and I put it back in the folder and started the car. What none of them knew, what I had told exactly one person, my roommate Jonelle, on a handshake understanding that she would not repeat it, was that I had already signed my first real client. Let me tell you about the years before that parking lot. My mother, Renata Callum, is not a cruel person in the way that word usually gets applied. She is practical in the way that people become practical when money has been unreliable their entire adult lives. She grew up in a house where her own father lost his warehousing job twice before she turned 12, and the lesson she absorbed from that, the one she carried into every conversation she ever had with me and Marcus, was that stability was the only thing worth chasing. Everything else was decoration. She worked as an office manager for a regional insurance brokerage for 22 years. Same desk, same commute, same firm. She was good at it. She was respected there. When I was 15, she was given a small plaque for a decade of service, and she put it on the mantel above the fireplace and left it there until we moved. She was not ashamed of the plaque. She was genuinely proud of it, and I understood even then that the pride was real, that it wasn't performance, it was what a decade of showing up and not losing the job actually looked like from the inside. So when I started drawing things seriously around age 13, floor plans at first, then furniture arrangements, then the way light moved through a room at different hours, she didn't discourage me exactly. She said it was a nice hobby. She said people who were good at drawing could do well in drafting, or in architecture if I was willing to study long enough, or in advertising. She said these things kindly. She meant them. What she could not accommodate on a structural level was the idea that visual creativity could be a business. Not a side skill applied to a business, the business itself. That gap between us was not new by the time I enrolled in the design program at Carver University. It had existed since I was 17 and showed her a layout I'd done for a friend's bedroom renovation, and she'd said, "That's really lovely, Nadia. You should be a real estate agent." I enrolled anyway. I got a partial scholarship based on my portfolio review, which helped, and I took out loans for the rest, which I did not tell her the full amount of, because I had done the math on my repayment timeline, and it was manageable, and I did not want the number to become a recurring argument. Carver's design program was rigorous in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. The first semester was almost entirely theory, design history, color systems, typography as a structural discipline rather than decoration, and I struggled with the pace. My GPA at the end of the first semester was 2.9, which was above the program's retention floor but not by much, and my advisor, Professor Dianose, called me in and asked me what was happening. I told her the truth, which was that I understood the material, but I was translating it slowly, that I thought visually, but I was being asked to articulate visual decisions in academic language, and the translation was where I was losing time. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "Then practice the translation until it's fast." She didn't say it unkindly. She handed me a reading list that was technically optional and strongly implied it wasn't. I spent winter break working through it. Not all of it, but most of it. I went back to Carver in January, and something had shifted. Not my taste, which I'd trusted since I was a teenager, but my ability to explain why a choice was correct, to defend it in a crit, to hold the logic of it under pressure. My GPA at the end of the second semester was 3.6. By my junior year, it was consistently above 3.8. I worked summers. My freshman summer, I worked at a print shop, which was unglamorous and exactly as useful as unglamorous things tend to be. I learned production timelines. I learned what files needed to look like before they went to a vendor. I learned the gap between what something looks like on a monitor and what it looks like on a physical surface. My sophomore summer, I worked as a junior designer at a small branding agency called Pellworth and Nash, where I was paid $14.50 an hour and given mostly asset resizing tasks, which I did without complaint and used to watch how the senior designers talked to clients. That was the education that mattered. Not the resizing. The watching. I noticed that the clients who were happiest were not always the clients whose work turned out best. They were the clients who felt that the designer had understood something about them before touching a file. The check-in calls. The way a senior designer named Roberta Finch would ask a client to describe their best customer before she asked anything about logos or colors. The way she would repeat something the client said back to them slightly reframed. So, what you're really protecting is the trust you've built with that demographic, and the client would lean forward and say yes, exactly, and Roberta would write something in her notebook and move on. I started doing that in my junior year studio projects. I started treating my professors as clients. I would ask them what problem they were hoping the project would solve before I started designing, and then I would make sure my presentation began with their stated problem before I showed them anything I'd made. My crits got easier. Not because the work changed, the work was already strong, but because the conversation around it was cleaner. By the time I was a senior, I had three things: a portfolio I was confident in, a working understanding of how to talk to clients, and a side project I had been building quietly for 8 months. The side project was a freelance identity system I developed for a woman named Cecile Varga, who ran a small textile importing business out of a converted warehouse space on the east side of the city. Cecile had been referred to me by a classmate whose older sister had used me to design a logo for her photography work. Cecile needed a full brand identity, wordmark, color system, packaging templates, the signage spec for her showroom. She had a budget of $4,800, which she paid in 2 installments, and the project took me 4 months of evenings and weekends. I delivered it in March of my senior year. Cecile walked through the presentation and did not say anything for almost a full minute, and then she said, "This is exactly what I meant when I didn't know how to say what I meant," and I understood that sentence completely. She referred me to 2 other clients before I graduated. One was her accountant, a man named Dov Mercado, who needed a refresh of his firm's website and collateral. The other was the owner of a boutique event space called Larkspur Hall, who needed a full brand overhaul before a relaunch. The Larkspur Hall project was my first engagement over $10,000. The contract was for $11,500, and it was signed, and the deposit was in my account on the Thursday before graduation weekend. That was what I was sitting with when my mother spoke those 11 words outside the auditorium. I did not tell her about Larkspur Hall at the graduation dinner. I told Marcus, quietly, while we were waiting for the check, and he pressed his fist briefly against my shoulder and said, "I knew it." My mother was talking to my aunt about the restaurant's parking situation and did not notice the exchange. I spent the summer after graduation working on Larkspur Hall and 3 smaller projects I'd picked up through Cecile's referral network. I had a home office, a second bedroom in the apartment I shared with Jonelle, and I had a business checking account and a basic contract template I'd had reviewed by a lawyer named Perry Holt, who charged me $300 for an hour of his time and was worth every cent. I called the studio Callum Studio, which was straightforward and easy to spell, and I built a website over 2 weeks in between client deliverables. My mother and I talked on the phone every Sunday. I did not lie to her. When she asked how things were going, I said they were going well. When she asked how I was finding clients, I explained the referral structure. When she asked if I was making enough, I said yes. And that was also true, though the margins were thin enough that thin, and enough for doing a lot of work in the same sentence. She did not ask for numbers. I did not offer them. At Thanksgiving that year, 5 months after graduation, she said over the dishes, I just want you to be thinking about what comes next, in case this takes longer than you're planning. I dried a serving bowl and put it in the cabinet and said, I'm thinking about it. She nodded. That was the whole conversation. Year 1 of Callum Studio ended with $87,000 in total project revenue. I know that number exactly because I looked at it often in that first year, not from pride but because I needed to understand the shape of the income, when it came, from whom, in what amounts, so I could plan the following year with more accuracy and less anxiety. The Larkspur Hall project had been the largest single engagement, but the referral network Cecile had seeded was generating a consistent flow of smaller projects, brand identities for independent businesses, collateral packages, the occasional website. My average project size at the end of year 1 was around $6,200. My average turnaround was 6 weeks. I had 7 active clients at any given point, and a wait list that had formed without my planning for it. In January of year 2, I hired my first contractor, a production designer named Femi Adiola, who I'd overlapped with briefly at Pellworth and Nash, and who was doing freelance work between agency jobs. Femi was faster than me at file production and more patient with vendor coordination, which freed me to spend more time on the front end of projects, the strategy conversations, the brief development, the presentations. The work got better. The clients noticed. The referrals accelerated. I moved out of the apartment at the end of year 2 and into a small dedicated office space, 1,200 square feet, in a building that also housed a landscape architecture firm and a financial planning practice. The monthly lease was $2,100. I signed a 2-year agreement and then sat with the signed copy for a while before I filed it. Year 2 revenue, $194,000. Year 3, I brought Femi on as a salaried employee and added a second contractor, a copywriter named Bex Okafor, who I used on projects that needed naming or brand voice work alongside the visual system. The studio now had a rhythm. I was managing rather than executing on most projects, which was a shift I had to learn. The instinct to fix things myself was strong, and I had to practice trusting Femi's production judgment even when I would have made a slightly different call. I also started getting inquiries from a different category of client. Not larger independent businesses, but the kind of clients who found me because another firm had mentioned us. Regional developers, a mid-size hospitality group, a specialty food brand that was preparing for a retail expansion. These clients had larger budgets and more complex needs, and they expected a different kind of engagement, more structured, more formally contracted, with project managers and milestone sign-offs. I brought in an operations consultant named Adrian Lowe for 6 months to help me build the internal infrastructure for that kind of work. Adrian cost me $4,200 a month and rearranged the way I thought about the studio's capacity. By the time she finished her engagement, I had a project intake system, a tiered pricing structure, and a clear sense of which clients we were going to pursue and which we were going to refer elsewhere. Year 3 revenue, $412,000. I did not tell my mother this number. We still talked on Sundays. The design studio had stopped being a topic she raised. She had adapted her references to it. She called it the business rather than the studio, which I noted without comment. And when I mentioned a project, she would ask practical questions about the client or the timeline rather than the ones she used to ask about when I was going to do something more stable. My brother Marcus, who was working in supply chain logistics and doing well, told me once that our mother had mentioned the studio to a friend in a way that sounded like cautious pride. He said she'd called it Nadia's design firm. I thanked him for telling me and let it land somewhere, and then moved on. The Sunday calls were fine. They were not close, but they were regular, and regular was something. The inquiry that changed the shape of year 4 arrived on a Wednesday morning in February in the form of an email from a woman named Soraya Ellison, who was a brand director at a regional hospitality group called Arden Collection. Arden owned 8 boutique hotels across 4 states. They were preparing to open 3 additional properties and were looking for a design partner for a unified rebrand, identity system, environmental graphics, collateral, digital templates, signage specifications. Soraya had been given my name by the specialty food brand we'd worked with in year 3. I read the email twice and then walked to the kitchen in the studio and made myself a coffee and stood at the window for a few minutes. The scope of what she was describing was significantly larger than anything we'd executed. It would require expanding the team. It would require a project structure I hadn't built yet. It would require me to price something where I didn't have a perfect comp in my own project history. I wrote back that afternoon. I said I was interested. I asked 3 questions about timeline and internal stakeholders, and I proposed an introductory call for the following week. Soraya wrote back within the hour. The call lasted 90 minutes. At the end of it, she said, "I'd like to bring you in to meet the executive team. We're looking at 3 firms. I want you to be one of them." I said I'd be glad to come in. The pitch meeting was 4 weeks later. I brought Femi and Bex. I prepared a presentation that spent the first 12 minutes not on our portfolio, but on what we had understood about Arden's positioning problem, the gap between their current visual identity and the kind of traveler they were trying to attract in their new markets. I showed them the research. I showed them 3 strategic directions, each built on a different answer to the same question about what Arden wanted guests to feel in the first 30 seconds of arrival. The room was quiet for the first few minutes of the presentation, in the way rooms get quiet when people have stopped preparing their responses and started actually listening. We were awarded the engagement 6 days later. The contract for the Arden Collection rebrand was $2.3 million over 18 months. It was the largest single engagement in the studio's history. It required me to hire 2 additional full-time designers, a dedicated project manager, and a production coordinator. I signed the contract on a Thursday and called Perry Holt to make sure everything in it was clean. He called me back the following morning and said, "This is a good contract, Nadia. Go build something." It was the Arden project that put Callum Studio into the design press. We were about 8 months into the engagement when Soraya submitted the project for a regional design competition called the Meridian Awards, which recognized work in brand identity, environmental design, and communication design across the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast. I hadn't submitted us for anything before. I'd considered it and decided the time investment wasn't right, and Soraya's submission was something she did on her own initiative and mentioned to me afterward. We were shortlisted in 2 categories, brand identity and environmental design. The award ceremony was held on a Thursday evening at a convention center in the city. It was a seated dinner, about 340 attendees, and the room was full of people from every major design firm in the region, firms that had been operating for decades, firms with 30 or 40 people, firms whose names I had known since I was in Professor Ose's classroom, trying to learn how to explain what I was seeing. I brought Femi and Bex and our project manager, a woman named Claudette Wren. We sat at a table near the center of the room. We won the brand identity category. When the presenter, a man named Gerald Ashby, who was the incoming president of the Regional Design Association, read our name, I heard Claudette make a small sound beside me, and I felt Femi's hand briefly press the back of my chair. I stood up and walked to the stage and shook Gerald Ashby's hand and accepted the award and said thank you to the room in about 30 words and walked back to the table. The industry press covered it the following morning. There were 2 trade publications that ran mentions, and one of them ran a short profile, 4 paragraphs, a photo of the award, that described Callum Studio as one of the quieter success stories of the last 4 years in the regional design market. Jonelle texted me the link at 7:15 in the morning with a string of punctuation I chose to interpret as celebratory. Marcus called and said, "Mom saw it." I said, "Saw what?" He said, "The article. Aunt Patricia sent it to her." I sat with that for a moment. "Okay," I said. "She didn't say much," he said. "Just read it and put her phone down. You know how she does." I did know how she did. The press from the Meridian Award generated 3 new inquiries within the following 2 weeks. One of them converted into a project. More relevant to the shape of the next year, it generated a call from a recruiter named Hal Stennis, who said he was reaching out on behalf of a firm he couldn't name yet, and could we find time to talk? I said yes, and we talked, and the firm was a larger regional design and architecture group called Praxis Studio Group, which had offices in 3 cities and roughly 60 employees. They were exploring an acquisition of a smaller, strong brand studio as a way to expand their identity and branding division. Praxis's creative director, a woman named Marguerite Flood, had seen the Meridian coverage and wanted to know if I would be willing to have a preliminary conversation about what a partnership might look like. I said I was willing to have the conversation, which was different from being willing to agree to anything, and I made sure Marguerite understood that distinction in our first call. She said she appreciated the clarity, which told me something useful about her. We had 4 conversations over the following 6 weeks. I brought in an attorney named Celine Park, who specialized in creative industry mergers, to advise me. Celine was precise and a little terrifying in the way good attorneys often are, and she walked me through what I was actually being offered. Not just the headline number, which was $3.8 million for a majority stake in Callum Studio, but the structure of it, what I'd retain, what my role would look like inside a larger organization, what the earn-out provisions meant in practice. I asked her, "What happens to the studio's name?" She said, "That's something you negotiate." I negotiated. The studio would operate as Callum Studio, a division of Praxis. My name stayed on the door. I would serve as creative director for the identity and branding division, reporting to Marguerite, with a defined scope of work and defined autonomy within it. The earnout was tied to revenue targets over 3 years that Celine and I had both stress-tested before we agreed to them. I signed the acquisition agreement on a Tuesday morning in the conference room at Celine's office. There were 7 people in the room, including Marguerite and 2 of Praxis's principals. Celine handed me the pen. I signed. We shook hands. Marguerite said, "We're glad you're here." I said, "So am I." It was announced 2 weeks later, in a press release that went out through Praxis's communications team. The trade press picked it up the same afternoon. That evening, I was in my apartment. I had moved to a larger place the previous year, making dinner when my phone lit up with a call from a number I recognized as my mother's landline, which she never used. She only used her cell. I turned the heat down on the stove and answered. She said, "I saw the announcement." I said, "I figured you might." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "I wasn't sure how it would go until it was signed." There was a pause. Not a long one, but the kind that has some weight in it. She said, "The article said the studio is worth." I said gently, "The article has the number in it. You can read the article." Another pause. She said, "Are you happy with it?" That was not the question I had expected. I stood at the stove with the phone against my ear and thought about it honestly for a moment. "Yes," I said. "I think so." She said, "Good." And then, after a beat, "I'm sorry about what I said at graduation." I said, "I know." She said, "I meant it at the time."
I didn't, she stopped.
"I didn't understand what you were building." I said, "I know that too." We stayed on the phone for a few more minutes and talked about Marcus and the restaurant where the graduation dinner had been, and whether they'd closed it yet, and then we said goodnight, and I put the phone on the counter and stood there for a while. The application arrived 4 months later. I had posted a position for a studio coordinator, someone to manage scheduling, vendor communications, onboarding paperwork for new clients, the administrative layer that had grown as the studio's volume increased. It was a full-time, in-office position. I posted it internally through Praxis's HR system and also through the studio's own website. Claudette had brought the applications to me in a folder, 12 in total, organized by date received. I was going through them on a Thursday afternoon when I got to the 9th one and saw the name, Renata Callum. I set the folder down on the desk and looked at the name for a moment. Her application was clean. She had listed 22 years at the insurance brokerage, where her responsibilities had included vendor management, scheduling for a team of 11, budget tracking, client correspondence, and a software transition project she had managed the year before her retirement. Her cover letter was 3 paragraphs. It was direct and factual. She said she was looking for work that used her organizational skills in a creative environment and that she felt her background was relevant to the position. She did not mention that she was my mother. I read it twice. Then I set it on top of the stack and went and made myself a coffee and sat at the window for a while. Claudette knocked on the door frame 20 minutes later and said, "You okay? You've been quiet."
I said, "Fine.
Come look at this." She came in and looked at the application. Her expression went through several stages. She said, "Is she?" "Yes," I said. Claudette said nothing for a moment. Then, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to think about it." I thought about it for 2 days. I called Jonelle, who had known about graduation afternoon since I'd come home from the parking lot, and told her about it. Jonelle listened and then said, "What does your gut say?" I said I wasn't sure. My gut and the right answer were the same thing in this particular case. She said, "Then what's the right answer?"
I sat with that.
I called my mother on a Sunday, which was when we always talked, but I called at 9 in the morning rather than our usual afternoon time. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "I got your application." A long pause. Then, I wasn't sure if I should say something first. I said, "I'm glad you didn't. I wanted to read it without." I stopped. "I wanted to read it as a document." She said, "Was it good?" I said, "Your qualifications are strong. The role would use them." She was quiet. I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need a real answer." She said, "Okay." I said, "Why this job? There are other places that would want your background." Another pause. Not evasive, considered. She said, "I want to understand what you built." I realized I should have tried to understand it sooner. This seemed like, she stopped. It seemed like an honest way to try. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "If you work here, I am your manager. That has to be completely clear." She said, "I know." I said, "If something isn't working professionally, we address it professionally. No Sunday calls about work. No family dinner conversations about work." She said, "I understand." I said, "I'll make a decision by end of week and have Claudette send you a formal response either way." She said, "That's fair." We stayed on the phone another few minutes. She asked about the Arden project, which she'd read about somewhere. I told her it had gone well.
She said it sounded like it had.
I sent her a formal offer letter on Friday. It was not different from the other offers we'd sent. The salary was $48,500 annually, which was the rate for the position. The benefits were what the position came with. The reporting structure was what it was. She accepted by email the same day. Her first day was a Monday, 3 weeks later. Claudette handled the onboarding. That was deliberate. I did not meet my mother at the door, or show her around the studio, or do any of the things that would have blurred the line I'd drawn. Claudette introduced her to Femi and Bex and walked her through the intake systems and the vendor contact list and explained how the scheduling software worked. I was in a client meeting that morning. When I came out, my mother was at her desk near the front of the studio, working through something on her screen. She looked up. I said, "Welcome aboard." She said, "Thank you." I went into my office. That was how the first day went. There was an adjustment period. My mother was disciplined and organized, and the vendors liked her, but she had spent 22 years in an industry with its own logic, and some of what she'd absorbed there didn't transfer cleanly to a design studio's rhythm. Claudette managed most of the calibration, which was right. There were 2 conversations in the first 6 weeks where I had to say something directly, once about a client communication she'd sent without running it by me first, once about a scheduling decision she'd made based on what she thought I'd want rather than asking. Both times I said it plainly in my office with the door closed, and she listened and adjusted. By the 3rd month she had settled into the role. The studio ran more smoothly in certain specific ways. Vendor invoices were processed faster. The scheduling backlog that had accumulated cleared. Femi told me once, unprompted, that she was good at the job. I said I was glad to hear it. The Sunday calls continued, at our usual time. We did not discuss work on those calls. It was a clean division, and it held. My Aunt Patricia called me about 7 months after my mother started at the studio. I hadn't spoken to Patricia since graduation, or at least not beyond the obligatory holiday texts. She called on a Wednesday evening and I almost didn't answer, and then I did. She said she'd seen the press about the acquisition. She said she'd read the Meridian Award coverage when it ran. She said she thought what I'd built was remarkable, and that she was sorry she'd laughed that afternoon outside the auditorium, and she said it in a way that sounded like she'd been carrying it for a while and wanted to put it down. I said, "Thank you for saying so." She said, "Your mom talks about you, about the studio. She's proud." I said, "I know." There wasn't much more to say, so we didn't try to say it. We wrapped up the call, and I put my phone down and looked out the window at the building across the street for a while. The thing about that afternoon in the parking lot, the thing I understood fully only in retrospect, is that it wasn't really about the degree. The degree was a container for a more complicated set of fears that my mother had about what happened to people who built things without guarantees, and those fears were not without a factual basis. She had watched people lose things. She had organized her entire life around the principle that the most important protection against loss was never being exposed to begin with. What she hadn't been able to account for was that some kinds of stability look nothing like stability in the early phases, and that certain things, the referral from Cecile, the 18 months of Ardent, the way Roberta Finch had once repeated a client's words back to them at a slightly different angle, can't be planned for, and can't be forecasted, and can't be put on a plaque. They just have to be built, incrementally in the evenings on a second-bedroom desk with a basic contract template that cost $300 and was worth every cent. My mother is still at the studio. She has been for going on 2 years now.
She is good at the job.
We are careful with each other in the ways that the situation requires, and we are also, slowly, and without fanfare, something we weren't before she applied. I don't know what that's worth. I know it's worth something. What I kept coming back to, in the months after the acquisition, after the award, after the application arrived in a folder with 11 others, what I kept returning to was a sentence Professor Osei had said to me once in her office when I was a junior and frustrated with a project that wasn't coming together. She had looked at the work spread on the table between us and said, "The clearest thing you can do for the people who come after you is to make something that didn't exist before." I'm not sure she meant it as broadly as I took it. I think she was talking about the project. But I've carried it in the context she didn't intend, and I think it holds there too. Make something that didn't exist before. Let it speak for itself. Don't argue about whether it's going to work while you're building it. Just build it, and let what it becomes be the answer to the question. That is what I know. That is what I would tell you. If you've been dismissed for something you were building, if someone looked at the early version and said cute with that particular weight behind it, I'd ask you this. On the night you got your first real client, before you told anyone, what did you feel in the 60 seconds after you read the confirmation? Because I think you already know what the building is for. If this story reached you today, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. And I'll see you in the comments.